I'm Brian Mann, and you're watching the first episode of Backbone Rails. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about the goals of Backbone Rails. In each episode, we're going to be building up to developing a fully featured client-side application from start to finish. This won't be your average to-do app. We'll be building something that's actually reflective of real use cases you'd find within day-to-day development. You'll get a chance to see a sufficiently complex application organically grow and refactor as we build on it layer by layer. Along the way, we'll master the tenets of scaling large JavaScript applications, and hopefully by the end of these screencasts, you'll possess a firm understanding of developing with Backbone, and you'll have sharpened your skills as a pragmatic programmer capable of solving difficult client-side problems. These screencasts aren't intended for total beginners. You should already be familiar enough with JavaScript and Backbone to not get stuck on little issues. There are plenty of resources for learning the basics available if you're not currently up to speed. Derek Bailey has an excellent introductory series on Backbone, as well as a myriad of other screencasts about JavaScript development in general. Peepcode also has a solid 3-part Backbone series worth looking into. There are also many other resources, screencasts, blogs, and tutorials found here. So let's just go ahead and get it out of the way. With JavaScript pretty much being the Wild West, building a rich client-side application is really hard. But JavaScript is absolutely here to stay, and it's becoming more and more prominent even outside of just the front-end world. As shocking as it is, JavaScript has become the cornerstone of modern development. You've no doubt seen tons of frameworks popping up all over the place. And Backbone has really secured itself as being one of the front runners, with an excellent track record and a vibrant community. Before we get into any specifics about Backbone, let's first talk about what you can do with it. Why go through the trouble of learning these frameworks and moving more logic to the client? Well, it turns out you can build really amazing applications, and what you're about to see represent great use cases for Backbone. Using Backbone to build apps like Google Analytics is entirely possible. It's easy for us to make asynchronous calls to the backend server whenever we need more data on the page. And showing loading messages while graying out the background in between page transitions becomes trivial with frameworks like Backbone. Wufoo is an application for building forms. It has really awesome drag and drop support affecting all of the controls immediately. Wufoo makes heavy use of a two-way binding system, which means changes to one area instantly propagates to another. This is what makes Wufoo so easy and intuitive to use. You might notice Wufoo's site is not entirely a single-page application, and that's okay. With Backbone, it's easy to integrate only parts of your application, implementing functionality here and there. Dialogues are also a common sight, and coordinating application events based on user selection comes easily with a framework like Backbone. Pandora, if you didn't know, is actually built with Backbone, including all of its user interface controls and interactions. Multiple views are automatically loaded dynamically and are kept in sync when tracks change. This is a single-page application because switching between different views doesn't cause your browser to have to refresh the page. New views are brought in, and old ones are closed down and removed. Rdio is also built with Backbone, and it's a fully single-page application. Rdio has developed a great caching system, meaning that pages that have already synced with the server instantly load, like in the settings area. This makes Rdio extremely fast and responsive, really improving the user experience. When we are fetching data from the server, RDO makes use of a simple loading spinner, which is something that we'll also be developing in our application. Pivotal Tracker's story system is a great example of a feature that can be developed with Backbone. You'll notice that all interactions are immediate and responsive, along with the simple use of a loading spinner while syncing with the server. Pivotal has an excellent long polling solution for acquiring recent changes made by other users, which creates the feeling of working in real time. Even though Pivotal Tracker is nothing more than glorified CRUD, you can see how these interactions dramatically improve the experience and its value as a business application. So even though each of these applications are visually distinctive and have different feature sets, they share a lot of common similarities. Each of these applications are built with client-side MVC, which is the first major step to moving business logic into the client and keeping it organized. So what is MVC? Model View Controller has been around a really long time, and it's quite popular with server-side frameworks. But it's only recently that we've implemented this pattern on the client. MVC is a pattern which splits up the various application layers into their own separate concerns and responsibilities. Back in the day, we used to mix these layers directly within the DOM, and that is, we would use HTML elements to also store data, like directly in their tags. Then, when HTML5 came out, we got more clever and started storing them in data attributes like data ID or data role and such. But with the MVC pattern, we can let the DOM just be the DOM, which is, after all, just our presentation layer and the responsibility of the view. Models should store data and state, and when that underlying data changes, views should update automatically to reflect those changes. So we can work with models elsewhere and keep view changes in sync. Controllers should be the layer which decide which views get used and which models get used, the same way controllers work on the server. So when we explore moving MVC to the client, we realize it affects how we develop with our backend server. The server's view layer gets almost completely replaced by the entire MVC stack on the client. When developing a fully single-page application, you will write little to no server view code. All view templates will be written in JavaScript. But the server and the client still have to communicate, and the good news is that by implementing MVC on the client, we can completely decouple the server from the client. The way data is processed back and forth is through JSON. JSON represents the communication bus. Here's a quick example of this in action. Say we received a JSON data set that came from the server after a user logged in. So in this case, we have Stanley Kubrick, who's a user logged into our system. And with Backbone, we take this JSON data and we bind it to some DOM elements like his name, his email, and his number of friends. So now let's go through a scenario after this user updates his information, which changes several of these data nodes. So we send a put to the server and it responds with the following changes. His name is now changed to, say, a different director like Paul Thomas Anderson, and the part of the DOM that was bound to this data node would be notified of the model attribute change and re-render itself. He also updated his email, and the DOM bound to that also re-rendered and displayed the new email address along with the proper first name. Lastly, he also changed his number of friends, removing 2 of them. So not only would the number change, but the previous list items would know to remove themselves from the DOM entirely. One of the first major hurdles we experience while building a client-side application is the mental challenge. Building these kinds of applications requires a significant change in our thought process while approaching problems. And the good news is, or rather, the bad news is, depending on how you look at it, is that you'll be solving those problems with JavaScript. JavaScript is a bit of a misunderstood beast that has gone through the ringer, picking up a wide range of distasteful characteristics over the years. And so what kind of screencast series would this be without a brief history lesson? Before 2005, there was no such thing as rich client-side development. The server would always provide all of the HTML content, and when you wanted to navigate to a different page, it would always require a full page refresh. And this, as you can imagine, is extremely slow and limiting. And JavaScript development in general was pretty much a total disaster. Object-oriented code was the rare exception, and you saw mostly procedural tangled mess. And the browser implementations and inconsistencies made JavaScript development something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemies. Oh, and we can't forget that after you pasted in some code to make a scrolling marquee work on a badass textured yellow background meant that you were probably qualified to slap JavaScript on your resume. From about 2006 to 2009, Gmail came along and made Ajax the newfangled thing to do. Ajax introduces a lot of new benefits. We could incrementally update the page because the server would return a portion of the page instead of the whole thing. And this certainly improved usability and speed. The downside was that in sufficiently large applications like Gmail, you would end up having what's known as spaghetti code. That is, you'd be running into callback soup everywhere you made that Ajax call, trying to coordinate various application events. But we did also overcome major hurdles with jQuery's standardizing DOM interactions, which meant you only wasted the other half of your day debugging CSS problems in Internet Explorer. But object-oriented patterns began emerging into the mainstream, picking up momentum and gaining traction. But these days were still wrought with jQuery plugins, except now you paste it in code for rotating carousel galleries instead of marquees. From 2010 until now, introduces the golden age of JavaScript development with rich, modern MVC. We've seen an explosion of client-side frameworks. There's no more reason to pack the DOM with anything other than what belongs there, semantic markup, and we can finally focus on data-driven models. This introduces a new way of thinking across the board from what we're used to, because, well, we have a lot more options and decisions to make as UI engineers. It's an exciting time to be a developer, though, but because everything is so bleeding edge, that means that we're developing in a time that's still very young and immature. Moving logic to the client hasn't been around nearly as long as server-side development, which has had time to establish conventions and patterns. But with our web apps performing more like desktop applications, moving to the stateful realm unlocks an unlimited potential for what we're able to build. We can now do much more, much faster than ever before. Here's a comparison between stateless server-side code of the past and stateful client-side code today. Back in the day, when we visit this URL, the server would process our request. It would send back the HTML content which our browser would parse and display as HTML. So now when we navigate to see tab number 2's content, we click it, which here we'd just be using a normal anchor link. This would redirect our browser to the new URL stored in that anchor link, and the pattern repeats itself. Clean slate, browser processes a request, and content is sent back. But let's take a closer look because this is a really important principle. When we think about it, we're letting a view element, in this case an HTML anchor, dictate the entire behavior of our application. Even though, yeah, for years, this is exactly how we've used an anchor. But think about it from a development perspective. Why exactly are we allowing this? Presentation, after all, has nothing to do with behavior. Yet HTML by default mixes these two together. It's saying we have an anchor element which looks a certain way and behaves a certain way. So let's revisit this concept, imagining we're using a client-side framework like Backbone to manage our application's behavior and state. Remember, we now control every bit of the browser's behavior, which allows us to change things up dramatically. We could use any element to represent this tab. All that's important is that it looks like a clickable tab. Our presentation layer, after all, should only be concerned with the way things look. So before our tab is clicked, let's assume that we had a view wired up listening specifically for this click event. And by doing so, we receive a notification of the event when it triggers. And now, at this point, how we proceed depends completely on what we want to have happen, step by step. In our case, let's assume after capturing the event, we want to prevent the default action. Then we want the parent LI to select itself so our tab becomes selected. We would want to fire our own custom event so the previous selected tab knows to deselect itself. And from this point on, we would probably bubble up the event to our managing controller, and from there it would decide what to do next. Let's assume we're requesting more data from the server. Our controller could close out the previous view and then manage the transition state of that old view closing down and the new one opening. Perhaps it would make the old one fade out and the new one fade in. The controller would also be responsible for handling the logic of pulling JSON data from the server. While we fetch our data and wait for a response, our controller would also know to make this view show a nice loading message, and so when our data returns, show the content. If the server responded with an error status code, the controller would also know how to gracefully handle that. And as a final step, at this point, we would decide whether we want this tab to be routable, meaning should users be able to refresh their page and get back to this specific tab. So let's just assume that we would want this to happen. So then we'd also decide to update the URL to reflect the current tab we're on. This is an example of how state works. There is no wipe and refresh and no page reloads. Changes incrementally happen on the page, and thus our state gradually changes. We, as the developer, get to dictate everything, all of the rules, the business logic, the behavior, and of course the implementation. HTML elements are back to being that, semantically dressed up content without built-in behavior. That means we get to be in the director's chair. Here's another visual representation showing how views are bound to their underlying data model. So say we have an event calendar here, and it was fed this data that came from the server. Once this data comes in, our month view would be wired up to re-render itself, which populates the daily events. And in the Backbone world, this is called a collection of models, with each model representing a corresponding event on the calendar. And at this point, you may not see any foreseeable advantage from doing this with traditional server-side templates. But watch what happens when we change our view context. When we move over to the week view, for this specific week, our previous month view would immediately close down, and the week view would populate. We don't need to fetch any new data from the server since our data model is already present. Our week view is wired up to this same data, but simply displays it in a slightly different way. With the old ways of achieving this with jQuery, you'd probably have each of these different month, week, and day views sitting in the DOM with a simple hide, show, toggle, switching them on and off. But that would be completely different from what we're doing. Our views are removed entirely from the DOM when they're not needed. And in the next episodes, we'll cover what makes up a view since they're real JavaScript objects. So back to our week view, we can see that now we're given a bit more information about each model in our collection. You can see that the Ruby meetup is plotted for the time range of 7 to 9 p.m., and also tells me the location I'll be going to. And of course, this is displaying because this part of the view template is bound to the model attributes over here. The Buy Flowers event I have on Valentine's Day hasn't been plotted on a time or place because those values are currently null, as in they haven't been set. So let's move on to the editing of the day view so I can go ahead and schedule a time and a place to buy those flowers. So let's see. Budget is a little tight this year. Haven't released these episodes yet, so gonna have to grab these from Walmart. And boss is all over me about these TPS reports, so just have to go when I get off of work. And on second thought, I can't really use those flowers, so I'll save a few bucks and just go for some chocolate. I'll end up eating most of it anyway. So let's save these changes to the server, and once the server processes them and sends us back the response, you'll see here that these model properties will instantly change. And there we go. Now, when we go back into our week view, our day edit view closes and the week view reappears. And without ever needing to pull new HTML content from the server, our week view would just immediately reflect the changes that we've made to our data, and now display this event in the proper slot along with a location and updated event name. As applications you're building grow in size and complexity, one of the hardest challenges working with server-side code is keeping multiple views in sync. And with JavaScript frameworks like Backbone, keeping different views in sync that are bound to the same underlying data is easily facilitated. And with that, we wrap up episode 1. In episode 2, we'll explore what day-to-day development is like with Backbone and cover the good, the bad, and the ugly parts. I'll also introduce you to a framework that provides the application structure on top of Backbone we'll desperately need to build scalable JavaScript apps.